Good, and we're recording now as well. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, welcome. My name is Professor David Bilchitz. I'm the director of SciFac, the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law, which is a center of the University of Johannesburg. And we welcome you to the seminar, which we are running in conjunction with the International Commission of Jurists, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and Constitution Hill, on a really vitally important question about access to a COVID-19 vaccine, perhaps one of the most important issues currently facing not only South Africa, but the world. And so we look forward to a discussion. Since I'm one of the panelists, I'm going to hand over to Tim Fish-Hodgson from the International Commission of Jurists, who will be our chair today, and introduce the other speakers. I just want to mention to you that we have seminar series going on. We've already had a number this year, and we have one in 2 weeks on the situation in South Sudan in our Africa series. And we look forward to welcoming you to that. So there was a recent peace agreement just signed, and there's a whole lot of developments going on. And so we will be engaging with that and top people and experts on that. We also have an exciting climate change series coming up from the middle of April. And please look out for the notifications about that. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone, and whatever other time it is, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome from the International Commission of Jurists. Other than moderating today and just moving issues from one place to another and keeping time, I'm just going to introduce the topic for you, and then I'm going to invite next Nancy Mtsibi from the KAS to do a little welcome also. But in general, the topic that we're discussing today is corporate obligations relating to vaccine access for COVID-19. The context is with SciFac being in South Africa, but also many other countries who are facing the same issues. And the one interesting thing that I thought that I would say to you to begin with is that this is a topic of a lot of contention internationally. So the ICJ is involved in the debates at the Human Rights Council about resolutions. There are 2 current resolutions the Human Rights Council is considering about access to COVID-19 vaccines. The one is led by Ecuador. And in that, civil society organizations, not only the ICJ, tried very hard to get even mention to the voluntary UN guiding principles on business and human rights in that resolution. And states almost unanimously either opposed this or simply ignored the suggestion. And this will be quite a strong resolution coming out of the UN Human Rights Council next week, probably, which will talk about the right to access to vaccines as a global public good, the right to health in that context, the need for sharing of technologies. But despite this, there is a strong resistance by states to talk about pharmaceutical companies and their obligations. And civil society on these platforms is really trying to say to states that it's not just about the progressive human rights agenda. By omitting reference to the human rights responsibilities or obligations of corporations, states are inadvertently taking responsibility for things that they could not possibly prevent by themselves. That without the interaction and the changing of policies and behavior of corporations could not possibly allow for equitable vaccine access. So it's a very interesting thing that's going on, and we'll hear more about what's happened in South Africa in connection with this and more generally from our speakers. But that's all I wanted to say as an introduction to the topic. And for now, it's for me to introduce the first speaker, who will briefly just do a welcome and wants to make some comments on the topic. And that's Nancy Mtsibi from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Could you please, you could start presenting. The speakers, you are welcome to, if you want to put your video off while you're not speaking, I'll leave mine on. And when we start speaking, the speakers, could we please turn our videos on? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon. I welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is a donor that provides funding for the promotion of democracy, good governance, and the rule of law. We have a long-standing partnership with SciFac. We also provide scholarships to gifted students studying masters in humanities. And this is combined with an internship at the South African Institute of International Affairs at FETS. To date, we have a big group of alumni who graduated under the auspices of this scholarship, who now work in the public and private sector in South Africa and abroad. Today's seminar comes at an appropriate time as we commemorate a year since the first positive COVID-19 case was confirmed in South Africa. It's also come at a time when we received some much needed vaccines for the health workers. Despite the drama surrounding the delivery of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, it seems we are making headway. While we celebrate the procurement of the vaccines, there are concerns about the rollout to the whole population. When and how will South Africa manage the rollout to all the people who wish to receive the vaccine? We must also bear in mind that there are those who prefer not to take the vaccine, and I guess we have to respect their choice. As President Ramaphosa emphatically stated that nobody will be forced to take the vaccine, nobody will be given this vaccine against their will, nor will the vaccine be administered in secret. But the main concern with South Africa being one of the most unequal societies in the world is, will there be an equitable distribution of the vaccine? Already there are media reports of some people using fraudulent means to get the vaccine, as well as some doctors falsifying documents to ensure that their spouses get the vaccine and some family members, even though they don't work in the medical field. One wonders what kind of measures are in place to guard against this. What measures are in place to ensure an equitable access to the whole population, including the undocumented migrants? The efficient rollout of the vaccine requires cooperation between the state and the private sector. Let me take this opportunity to thank David and the team at SciFac for organizing this event. And I also wish to thank Tim, who will be our moderator today, and our esteemed panelists for making time to present today. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. As David has put in the chat already, please do throughout, if you have questions, put them in the chat here with your name, and we might be able to answer those questions directly at whichever stage. And there will be an opportunity to ask some questions, audio and video later on too. But to begin with, now that we've gotten that very brief introduction, I'm going to invite the first of our speakers to speak, and that would be Sharifa Sekelala. Sharifa is working at the University of Warwick, and she's an interdisciplinary researcher whose work is at the intersection of international law, public policy, and global health. And she has a primary focus on infectious diseases. Sharifa, when you're done speaking, I think that it would be great if you could post some of the publications that you've done and co-written. She's been publishing a lot on COVID-19 and human rights and vaccine access and human rights globally. So Sharifa really has quite a global context and a broad expertise on the healthcare and human rights issues that are relevant to this topic. So we're really thrilled to have you, and welcome. All of our speakers, as we've told them before, have about 15 minutes, and we will start flagging you down relatively ferociously when that time gets to that. But the floor is yours until then, Sharifa.
Yeah, thanks, team. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, we can
yeah,
hear you.
Thanks, team, and thanks, David and Fatima, for joining me. I'm really excited to be here speaking about privatization of a COVID-19 vaccine. And I think I want to go in some ways beyond intellectual property, which I think Fatima will discuss really greatly. So I'll spend just a little bit of time speaking about IP rights and then move on to think about kind of the wider implications of the privatization of the COVID-19 vaccine as I see it. And this fits in very neatly from some of Nancy's interventions around equity and access and who's going to get it and who's going to be excluded. So we have a couple of international legal frameworks that help us to think about the right to vaccine, the right to life, the right to health, and what Fatima, I think, will cover in great detail around the TRIPS agreement and what that means for vaccine access, especially for countries for the global south. So I'm going to skip all that and really then think about, in some ways, what the underlying rationale for private companies is for having patents. So the underlying rationale for companies that have patents is that they spend lots of money on research and development, and therefore they need to recoup these costs by setting a price, and therefore having these patents that protect the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance. But I think we see very quickly that with the COVID-19 vaccine, we've already had lots of public money that has gone into this vaccine. For instance, 2.4 billion, COVAX contributed $2.4 billion before the end of 2021 for the COVID-19 vaccine. And also similarly, we see that many governments have contributed funding for R&D research, but also have contributed in kind. And I think one of the things that for me is really interesting is the lack of clarity and transparency around many of these agreements between corporations and states. So for instance, in the UK, AstraZeneca was given prior planning permission before it was approved in order to build its factories. And this was considered and heralded as a really good thing. But all of these are part of what we kind of call these pull and push mechanisms, where private companies are being incentivized in order to produce vaccines, which we think are ostensibly a public good. And I think that one of the things that bothers me as a global health lawyer is the lack of transparency around this process. And also, in some ways, the fact that states are still clinging onto this R&D rationale as a mechanism of maintaining intellectual property rights. And I think that this is really problematic as we go on. So one of the really interesting things around the COVID-19 vaccine has been that from the very beginning, we had a strong equity rhetoric around it. So we had this idea that it was going to be this public, global public good, and we were going to actually think about inequality being minimized within the crisis. But what I want to show within my presentation is the way in which this hasn't happened, and actually the way in which actually the COVID-19 vaccine has reproduced inequalities both globally and at the national level in a way that is really problematic when we think about human rights more generally. So one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has illustrated is this notion of a dual track system. Through COVAX, we had developed countries who were contributing to a pool, but also having bilateral agreements between themselves and manufacturers. And the problem with that was that this meant that COVAX itself was always doomed to fail, because manufacturers were going to always supply those pre-authorized vaccines that had been paid for by these high-income countries. And at some point at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of outrage when it was discovered that around 16% of the world's population had the entire vaccine supply. And everybody felt that this was horribly unjust and this was an inequity. But I think what we are less focused on now is the fact that this is still continuing to happen. So for instance, Canada has already taken some doses from COVAX, despite having quite a huge and abundant supply through its bilateral mechanisms. And I think that this is one of the things that really is concerning when we think about global inequity, but also when we think about the role of corporations within this space. The second thing for me that I think is of concern is this notion of bilateral agreements. And we're seeing that increasingly low and middle income countries are signing bilateral agreements between them and countries in order to get the vaccine. So for instance, we had the case where Uganda is paying about $14 for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which actually costs $2.16 a dose. And I think that this is not something that's just between the state and a corporation, because this is something that has kind of wider human rights concerns because of the way in which we would like to think about equity. And one of the things that I find really concerning about this case is, in some ways, the Ugandan response was, this is a demand and supply issue. We're a small country, we're landlocked. It costs a lot of money to get the vaccine to us, and we need to factor all of this in terms of the price. And I think that this shows the potential problems that you have with this notion of privatization, that once you leave things to the market, it's never going to lead you to an idea of public good. It's going to really mean that the market sets the price. And so smaller countries with smaller economies of scale are going to get a much worse deal from these global schemes, which is something that is deeply problematic. And when we move to the national level, I think that we're also seeing ideas of this reproduction that is happening at the national level. So for instance, we're already starting to see public-private distinctions, which are creating another dual track. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about this dual track where rich countries could pay into a communal track for all of us, but could also buy vaccines for themselves. And we are also seeing it with the fact that in some countries, you can pay to have the vaccine, and some people have to wait for a free vaccine. And that is going to lead to huge inequities where, especially where you are having ideas that people need to prove that they have comorbidities. For instance, if you're really poor, you not only have to go to this private hospital, but you then have to probably get another series of tests that helps you to show that you then have these comorbidities in order to gain access. And I think that all of these are bottlenecks for people who urgently need this vaccine. In Egypt, we already saw ideas around kind of this co-payment. And while co-payment essentially would be well and good in middle-income countries, we must think about people who can't afford to pay. So these are small sums of money, but I think this is really problematic. We've also increasingly seen the idea of corporations as distributors of vaccines. And this is where corporations are joining governments in ideas of distributing vaccines to their employees. But I think that there are always dangers that this is going to create a two-track system where if you're on a corporate track, you get the vaccine much quicker, much faster, much more efficiently than people who are on the free track, which is kind of the national prioritization track. Another thing that I find concerning in some ways is the digitization of access for COVID-19 vaccines. So very many countries are either putting national ID as a prerequisite for the vaccine, and the national ID in many of those instances is not free. Other countries are using apps in order to register for those vaccines. And we already know that digitization is largely exclusionary for huge parts of the population that are poor. So if you need an app in order to register for a vaccine, this is going to take a huge amount of people out because they have no smartphones. They cannot pay for their airtime because it's a precious resource. And so I think that digitization of access to the vaccine itself, I think is something that we need to be really thinking about at this point. The last point that I want to raise around privatization at the national level is the idea around transparency. There's a lot of transparency, and I think Nancy has talked about that in terms of blanket statements around healthcare workers. Who are they? What does that include? Does it include people who work in universities and labs who have very little access, who have very little risk? And I think this lack of transparency is really problematic because we are increasingly seeing reports of inner circles around governments getting prioritized. And I think this is going to really become a problem in the future. So I have two examples here that I think are really important for us to think about. So for instance, the first one is in Uganda, where they have a group called special interest groups. And it's just really not clear who special interest groups are. And special interest groups could be legitimate. It might be people who we think are really important in order to galvanize the vaccine drive and help with vaccine hesitancy. But even then, I'm really not convinced that they should be the first people to be vaccinated. So I think that at the point when you're facing vaccine hesitancy, that might be the point when you vaccinate special interest groups. But I think at the beginning of a vaccination drive, it's really problematic to have a group like that. The other thing that struck me there, which I didn't highlight, was security personnel. And I'm not really quite sure why we have security personnel being prioritized in some countries. The second one was India's prioritization drive, and it started off with healthcare workers, which I had some problems with what healthcare workers meant, but I could let that go. But I think the second one was the group who are either over 60. And I think that although people who are over 60, so elderly, are vulnerable, not all of them are equally vulnerable. And so that is something that we really need to think about as we think about vaccination. But also for me, the second and the most disturbing one was the one between 45 and 59 who have other illnesses, because we very much know that the middle classes can very easily prove that they have these other comorbidities. Well, if you're poor, then your ability to prove things becomes more problematic. And I think that these are situations where actually these ideas of a private vaccine then really leads to further inequities down the line. And so in some work that I have done, we've really thought a lot about how we should vaccinate, how we should prioritize vaccines. And one of the things that we try to think about is whether the vaccines can help us to think about people who have poor social determinants of health. So these are people who, again, so people, for instance, who might be illegal migrants, as Nancy mentioned, who are particularly vulnerable, but might not be in these groups that governments are prioritizing at the moment because they don't have national IDs, they don't have smartphones, they cannot prove that they have comorbidities. And so it's really thinking through whether we can use other approaches of prioritization that are not mentioned. And so I think that there is some time to start thinking about that in low and middle income countries, and we should take that quite seriously. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, so I have two final points that I want to talk about because I'm sure I'm running out of time, is vaccine tourism, and the last one is kind of, or three, great. Vaccine tourism, and the last one is really thinking about the future of COVID-19 going in to prove that we've all been vaccinated. And so I think that we're already seeing this, the way in which the COVID-19 crisis has always kind of grossly heightened inequities. So some people have choices. So for everybody else, for me, one of the major things around having one public vaccine drive is that people have no choice. So everybody gets a vaccine, and we don't think so much about what people are getting. We just think that we have been vaccinated. But for the very super rich, you have options of flying to another country so that you can get Moderna because it is a much more superior vaccine that will protect you at 95%. And I think that we need to be very aware that in prioritization, we have really reproduced these inequalities because we have then given people choices to demand much better vaccine access than others. And so we already started to see this with vaccine tourism. Increasingly, we will see this once high-income countries' economies reopen, because very many of those corporations will demand particular vaccines for people from developing countries that protect them to a much more heightened level. And so they will be giving some parts of the population these vaccines. So you might, for instance, think about a university sector thinking, I want university students to come from abroad, and therefore I'm going to vaccinate some of them in their home countries, and further create inequalities. And this might even be further problematic if you think that some of those students who are being vaccinated have already been vaccinated because they are part of some inner circle. And so they are getting twice the amount of vaccine before anybody in that country who's poor can have it. And so I think that privatization kind of has these multiple problems that we are only just beginning to see, and we should really be attentive to as these vaccination drives continue. And so there was this story in the Times. So apart from my shock that cathedrals also have adverts in the Financial Times. There was another one about high flyers going to the UAE again in order to get particular vaccines, because in the UK, you didn't have so many options. And so when you went to the UAE, you could then have your vaccine of choice. And then the last one is, again, for people who are in a private club, 25,000 and above, you can be flown to this country, have some sun and have a vaccine as well. And so I think that this is deeply problematic. And the last point that I want to make is around the end of COVID-19. And again, this perpetual privatization that we are seeing already in the rhetoric of COVID-19 passports. And the thing with COVID-19 passports that strikes me is that it's really a deeply problematic idea because of the notion of commodification of the vaccine as access. So it commodifies the vaccine in order to give you access to public life, in order to give you access to a job, in order to give you access to some socialization. And I think that that is really deeply problematic, because when we try after this crisis to tell people that they need other drugs, it's not going to be as easy to convince them if we have already commodified one drug. The second thing for me is that, again, here, because you have these dual tracks, is that there's a real danger that people are going to try and seek to game the system to get the better vaccine, to forge, which is really bad when you think about national health systems. And lastly, I think that we are going to really see that we are going to exclude lots of people, because how are you going to prove that people have been COVID-19 vaccinated? You're going to need private corporations. They're going to then need to certify people. They invariably are going to charge people. And I think on that note, I will then let David talk a lot about the obligations that we should put on these private companies in the next kind of 5 to 10 years.
So thank you, Sharifa. And you've not only done a very good job of illustrating the breadth of the issues around the world that relate to privatization and vaccines and COVID-19, but you've now also done my job as a moderator, because you've basically said what David's going to speak about. So Professor David Bulshitz is the director of SciFac and a professor of fundamental human rights and constitutional law at the University of Johannesburg. He's also a professor at the University of Reading and the vice president of the International Association of Constitutional Law and a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. If you haven't heard him speak already, you're in for a treat, because David's also a very charismatic speaker and is widely published in the area of business and human rights, which is what he's going to speak to now. As Sharifa said, the responsibilities and or obligations of corporations in the context of this private involvement in vaccine procurement, access, production, and distribution. So thank you very much, David. You have the floor.
Thanks very much, Tim. Am I audible?
You are audible and visible.
Brilliant. And you can see the presentation. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And also, Sharifa has outlined this kind of private context so well for of what's happening around COVID-19. And that's where I want to start, right? I'm going to start just focusing on the vaccinations themselves. I know Sharifa's kind of focused on a wider context as well. They have been produced, and I think Fatima is going to engage with this a bit more, but research, some of the research was done by private companies, in some cases with public funds. Other cases, research has been done by public institutions like universities in the case of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Largely the production and manufacture of the vaccines is in the hands of pharmaceutical companies. And these are obviously life-saving, health-improving vaccinations, which private companies have either developed or now produced, and patent laws bolstered by the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement protect their intellectual property, right? And just a slide showing you the wide variation in the actual costs of the vaccine. And they actually, as Sharifa pointed out, they actually differ in bilateral agreements as well, but you can range from anything from $37 for vaccination to $4, right? So the question I'm going to ask relates to the fundamental rights obligations of these pharmaceutical companies. Now, there are lots of elements here, and this is a complex area, and I'm only going to be able to touch the surface of it and provide a specific approach. But there's a question, firstly, of do companies have any obligations in relation to fundamental rights? I'm not going to focus on that. You can also phrase the question as to whether states should impose obligations on such companies, okay? So one can sort of be a bit nuanced about that and avoid some of the complex debates there. Assuming they have obligations, what are they, right? Many people say, and at the international level, there's been a focus on companies having negative obligations not to harm rights. And here, pharmaceutical companies, in the context of COVID, they're not causing the COVID-19 harms, right? There's a virus around, that's what causes the harms. So the focus really, in my view, is really on their positive obligations actively to help realize rights and enable people to have vaccines. The distinction, of course, is a little bit fuzzy because the omission to provide actually causes harm. Okay, but I'm not going to focus on the distinction and the blurriness of negative versus positive. And I'm going to say we focus on the question of, do they have positive obligations? And if so, what are they? And I'm going to consider a number of possibilities. Number one, to provide the vaccine for free, okay? Or alternatively, to price the vaccine at a level affordable to countries around the world. That is to some extent vague. And as Sharif has pointed out, differential pricing can be to the benefit of the wealthy, but the kind of version that I'm interested in is differential pricing according, in a sense, to progressive kind of taxation way of thinking, right? So it would be according to ability to pay, right? So countries with a lesser ability to pay would pay less per vaccine, okay? And the last kind of possible positive obligation here is to ensure there is an adequate supply, because that's one of the central issues at the moment in terms of bottlenecks and the inability to gain enough vaccines across the world. So broadly, what am I going to do? I'm going to focus on the positive obligations. I've told you, I'm going to provide you with an analytical framework for thinking through their obligations. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to do two things: to price the vaccine at an affordable level to all countries around the world, accepting that this may involve the kind of differential pricing I mentioned, and to ensure there is adequate supply, which could involve granting the license to other companies to manufacture or accepting restrictions on their intellectual property rights. Companies, in my view, should accept these obligations. Given their self-interested nature that's been accepted in our world today, they may not. And if that's the case, states should enforce these obligations, right? So quickly situating this question, there is a moral dimension to the question about what should society expect of corporations. And there's also a legal one. What does the law require? Now, I've got to be very quick in summarizing my view that fundamental rights are essentially urgent moral claims that demand legal institutionalization. So there's a relationship between the moral and the legal in fundamental rights. And so what I'm going to say straddles the boundary between the two. Fundamental rights recognized in international law in the South African Constitution and many other constitutions around the world require, in my view, that corporations have positive obligations. But if such positive obligations are not recognized in legal systems, in domestically or internationally, the claim is they ought to be, okay? Now, the law, there are different levels at which we can deal with this at the law, at the international level and the South African Constitutional Court level. I am not going to focus on the national level per se, because this is a wider question. And also, if South Africa imposes obligations and no one else does, that can actually be serious repercussions. In the limited time that I have, I'm not going to focus on a detailed positivist legal argument. Rather, what I am going to do is provide an analytical framework for determining the substantive content of corporate obligations in relation to fundamental rights. If you want to know more, there's much more detail and much more justification than I can do here in my new book, which will come out towards the end of this year with Cambridge University Press, called Fundamental Rights and the Legal Obligations of Business. But I'm going to sketch some ideas in relation to one chapter which relates to positive obligations here. So the starting point, fundamental rights are rooted in dignity, in a notion that we all have value, right? And this commitment to the value, dignity of individuals requires that we respect their foundational interests. And those foundational interests, interest in freedom, interest in resources like food, housing, healthcare, are protected by fundamental rights. Now, importantly, fundamental rights are articulated from the perspective of beneficiaries or victims or rights holders. If I have a right to life, my interest is that my life is preserved and protected. Rights are articulated from the perspective of the rights holder. They are agnostic, I would argue, as to who has the obligations, right? Is it the state only that has the obligations? Is it companies? Is it other individuals who have obligations? Fundamental rights don't tell us fundamentally that. They just require respect for those entitlements. And so the question, particularly in relation to resource issues, is how do we allocate those obligations? Now, I articulate a framework for the allocation of positive obligations, which has three parts. One are factors related to the rights holder. We'll go through those. Factors related to the obligation bearer. And lastly, a framework in which we evaluate the questions and these factors because they pull in different directions. Why should you accept this framework? Again, I can't go into this in detail. I would argue that it's drawn from an analysis of various court decisions around corporate obligations, and it draws out and systematizes existing practice. It identifies relevant normative factors. It can give expression to normative complexity, that there are actually factors pulling in different directions. It allows for the incremental development of our understanding of positive obligations, and it provides a structured mode of reasoning to reach conclusions on the substantive content of positive obligations. So to see if you think it's useful, well, I'm going to go through, in a way, applying this framework without defending all its components in relation to the question at hand. So what about factors that relate to the rights holder? Okay, the first question is the interest or the right affected. The rights affected by COVID are multiple. Their life itself, 2.6 million people are dead. Healthcare, okay, sick people get very sick. There's issues of long COVID. Livelihoods, from the ILO report I looked at, there's been an increase of global unemployment by 33 million people and a reduction of labor incomes of 3.7 trillion US dollars. These are fundamental important interests which are urgent. They relate to the most important things we care about. And the principle we should follow here in making judgments is, I would argue, the more urgent the interests, the stronger the case for positive obligations and the extent thereof. Now, as I said to you, I'm not going to go into detail of legal provisions. I'm just going to point out to you here, we can pull out the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 6 on the right to life, which has been interpreted expansively, not just to deal with deprivations, but also access to such goods as a vaccine. We can look at the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and here we have the highest obtainable standard of physical and mental health. We have treatment of prevention and treatment of and control of epidemic diseases, the right to work. And we can, of course, look at the national level. And here we're dealing with the Constitution of South Africa and Section 8.2, which deals with the application to actors beyond the state and various rights that I've listed. So the interests are fundamental and urgent. The second issue which I would raise is the question of vulnerability, right? And this is something that's raised by the Colombian courts when they deal with these issues. And I think it's very important as a central part of thinking about rights holders. And the principle we can establish is the greater the vulnerability, the greater will be the justification for imposing positive obligations and the extent thereof. And that requires thinking through the real power relations at stake, okay? And currently the manufacture and supply of vaccines are in the hands of companies. Individuals are entirely dependent on that manufacture and vulnerable to the power. Intellectual property systems give them a monopoly. And so poor countries lack the ability to pay high prices. So there's a high degree of vulnerability, which then translates into the last question of looking at the concrete impact on the interests of individuals of the lack of action by corporations. The principle here being the greater the impact, the greater the case for the positive obligations and their extent. And the failure to provide vaccines universally affects our most basic things, and we're incredibly vulnerable in related to that. Okay. So the second set of factors that I wanted to consider, which I believe the framework requires, is thinking through the nature of obligation bearers. And the flip side, right, of some of the other interests is the capacity of the obligation bearer to affect our interests, right? And the principle we can establish is the greater the capacity, the stronger the prima facie obligations that a corporation has. Pharmaceutical manufacturers have the sole power to manufacture and produce these vaccines. Prima facie, they have obligations. However, there is a qualification here. I don't think capacity is sufficient to determine obligations, though it's necessary. Why? Because it potentially places an unlimited level of obligations on powerful corporations and would contradict their economic purposes. And it also fails to take account of the fact that there are multiple actors with the capacity to provide. Okay. The second factor I think that's critical in relation to the obligation bearer is the function they play in society and the role they have, which affects their capacity. The principle here is if corporations have a specific social function and need in the sphere in which they operate, they will have positive obligations to advance fundamental rights in that sphere, and it will affect the extent thereof. Okay. Pharmaceutical manufacturers operate in a sector that relates to foundational, constitutional, and international rights. That is partly what gives them their profitability. People and governments will pay a lot to save lives and enhance healthcare. They specifically decide to operate in an area of pressing social need, and that provides a strong case for them to have enhanced obligations and to expect them to do so. And contrast that, to understand this point, with a jewelry company, which operates in the sphere of luxuries and not in the sphere relating to our most fundamental interests. Okay, their function, I would argue, is not obviously a purely private one, where it relates to goods that have a foundational impact on our lives, and there are limited opportunities to access such goods. The third factor, which pulls in a different direction, is what we might call autonomy. It recognizes that corporations, as constituted today, are not simply parts of the state and have their own purposes and goals that flow from those of their shareholders. Their shareholders have economic purposes in setting up the corporation. The shareholders did not create Pfizer or Moderna simply for altruistic reasons, however we may wish they did. They are entitled in the current system and premises of the system to achieve their economic goals through making profits due to their investments. And so the principle here is the greater impact that exists on autonomy, the greater the justification will be needed for onerous positive obligations. This will tend to reduce what we require of individuals and corporations to a lesser extent, because they're not identified exactly with individuals. And here it will be critical to distinguish what I would argue a restriction on autonomy and an obliteration of that autonomy, or a reduction in profit to creating loss-making entities. And the last factor one needs to consider when dealing with positive obligations is that there are other actors who have the capacity to provide. So intuitively, if a homeless person in our neighborhood needs help, they can't claim it from one person, but from all the people who live in the area or the state. Okay, so which actors have the obligations? And here we need to consider, on the one hand, the state and the corporation. States have duties as well, but they have effectively outsourced their manufacturing to the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Okay, and there is a question about whether that should be the case, but that's how we currently are in the current state of being. Okay, and so pharmaceutical manufacturers have a unique position to supply, and it can't be an obligation on the state alone, right? We also need to consider the role of other private actors. And here we would argue that there has to be a shared obligation amongst pharmaceutical manufacturers that have patents over vaccines proportional to their capacity. So it will not fall on Pfizer alone, but on Pfizer, Moderna, AZ, etc., to make accessible these vaccines and supply all effective vaccines and proportional to their ability and size. Okay. And to do this, there will be a need for some coordination of provisioning amongst them to avoid duplication and inefficiency, something we need to think about as human rights people of how to deal with that kind of question of coordination, okay? And morally, other private actors could also be involved, NGOs and philanthropists, but we won't deal with that now, okay? So I'm coming to the end now, right? We've got those various factors. How do we make a decision about positive obligations? Well, this is a complex inquiry. I'm going to simplify it here, but it ultimately requires, I would argue, evaluating the serious harms to rights that can occur against the burdens on the company or non-state party. And it requires us to think through the range of alternatives and ensure a realization of rights with a limited impact or reduced burden on the non-state party. So let's think about providing the vaccine for free. Essentially, that would be a form of nationalization of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Now, one might argue for that, but it's not really consistent with the current model of providing and engaging with healthcare in our world at the moment. It places the whole burden on pharmaceutical manufacturers. It completely ignores the autonomy component and their nature as a private corporation. And possibly it destroys incentives to produce better drugs in the future, which may actually harm healthcare in the future. Unless there's no other way, I would suggest it's preferable to consider other alternative approaches. What are those alternatives? What about providing at an affordable rate, including progressive differential pricing? That would address the urgent interests of beneficiaries, place some obligations on states to the extent they are capable of providing, place some obligations on other private actors, and require a reduction in the profits of pharmaceutical manufacturers, not an obliteration. I would argue for those reasons, this is required by fundamental rights law. And similarly, expanding supply. This would meet beneficiary interests and help end the pandemic globally. It would share out the burden of supply amongst pharmaceutical manufacturers, even those without intellectual property, and reduce the profits of each pharmaceutical manufacturer, but still recognize autonomy interests. And here there are different possibilities. It could be that the manufacturer that actually developed the vaccine would license it to others for some kind of fee, and so recoup some benefits there. Or alternatively, there could be some form of compulsory licensing. Either way, extending supply is also required, I would argue, by anyone who accepts fundamental rights in international law or constitutional law. So in conclusion, pharmaceutical manufacturers are not just private entities that can make profits as they like. They control vital life-saving medications that affect individual lives and health. COVID-19 vaccination remains one. They remain non-state entities in the model I've provided. But fundamental rights, I argue, can deal with both aspects, capture this complexity by requiring two things: accessible and progressive differential pricing, and expanding supply quickly and efficiently to root out disease. And as mentioned, I've had to summarize quickly. So if you want to see more details of the kind of framework and the justifications for the framework I provided, hopefully that will be available in my new book towards the end of the year. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I went slightly over my time.
Thanks, David. And thank you for the questions that have been put in the comments box. A reminder to put more questions there. We're going to have plenty of time left for questions afterwards. Two things to flag for now is one, I know we have experts here, and I'm going to ask you to try and contribute potentially later on what's been going on in the South African courts about direct horizontal obligations and positive obligations, and what implication that might have for David's argument. And then also we have international experts here on the responsibility to respect human rights, speaking in a slightly different language. And so the question that I'd have for you and the inputs that I want to hear later is about whether or not the same argument David is making could fit under that responsibility to respect human rights, which I personally think it could, but I'd like to hear from our experts a bit more. Now we're going to move on to our last speaker for the panel. And this is someone who you've been on social media, or if you've Googled vaccine for COVID-19 in the last 3 months, you probably have seen Fatima Hassan's name. Fatima is the executive director and founder of the Health Justice Initiative, and has got years and years and years of experience in working on access to medication, access to healthcare services, previously in an HIV environment and in other environments. And I'm not going to dilly-dally with any more details for an introduction, but Fatima, thank you for agreeing to speak, and we're looking forward to your presentation on vaccine equity and access.
Thank you, Tim. Can you hear me okay? And you can see the slides, right?
Yes, we've got everything. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try and get through the presentation in 20 minutes so that we can have a bit of a Q&A. And I think it's quite fitting that I'm speaking to you today on the 11th of March, which actually represents the 1-year commemoration. I wouldn't call it an anniversary because an anniversary signifies something to celebrate, but a commemoration of the 1-year declaration of a pandemic by the World Health Organization. We've also just been told that our own government has extended the disaster declaration by another month. So we've actually been in a state of disaster now for over a year. And, I want to say to David and to Sharifa, thank you for all of that input, but it's actually quite simple. Today is a global day of action, and the way in which we can actually ensure equitable access to vaccines is simply to drop the patents. That's what needs to happen in the middle of a pandemic, because the problem is that we're still treating vaccines and diagnostics as if it's a commodity. We've previously said it's not a piece of jewelry, it's not a car, it's actually a life-saving intervention. And I think that's part of the problem. I don't know if some of you know, but David was actually our expert in one of the cases that we brought last year in relation to the excessive pricing of face masks. And that's going to be important later when we look at price gouging in a pandemic and the issue of the lack of price transparency of companies. So Tim, if you could just remind me to deal with that maybe later in the Q&A. And in that case, as well as in previous HIV/AIDS cases, we have argued that Section 27 of the Constitution has to be interpreted in a particular way to take cognizance in the case of HIV/AIDS of a public health crisis, and in the case of COVID-19 in a pandemic. And so we've got some really useful jurisprudence already in the Competition Appeal Court about how do you interpret competition law, but also the right to access to healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. It's not the normal obligations that would necessarily be in place or be in play. And similarly, government's obligations would be heightened and would be much more different, we would argue, in the case of a pandemic. The problem, however, as I'm going to explain to you in this presentation, if we can go to the next slide, please, is that the pharmaceutical companies and the different wealthier governments that have actually co-funded a lot of the accelerated vaccine research are basically using their own law. So I call it the law of God. Pharmaceutical companies right now are acting as if they're God. They're determining access for the entire world, including the global south. So the constitution has been thrown out of the window, particularly in the domestic context of South Africa. And also the rules of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that reside in TRIPS, because there's just been so much opposition to actually using the current flexibilities that reside in TRIPS. And so the challenge that we also have is an existential and ideological one, because we do have in certain cases some kind of system for rule of law and democracy, but that's being undermined by profiteering and what I would argue greed. So let's just start with the notion of a people's vaccine and why that particular framework is important to inform what the obligations are, not just of pharmaceutical corporations, but governments as well as research institutions and scientists and anybody else involved. So somebody is, I've been Zoom bombed before. I just hope that that's not currently what's happening. So the idea behind the people's vaccine is that everyone everywhere in the world who needs access to it should be able to get it, at the point of entry. And the issue around vaccines is that it's not just limited to vaccines. It relates to all, diagnostic tools and treatments. And so while the People's Vaccine Campaign may be having a particular focus on the issue of vaccines, the battle is much larger. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure if you can see this clearly or if there's a way in which to make it, to enlarge it. But this is from the Lancet, and it's a really useful slide around the amount of public co-funding and philanthropic co-funding for accelerated vaccine research. So if you can't see the exact data, I'll just take you through some of the numbers so far from the information that we have, because there hasn't been a lot of transparency and sharing of information. It's actually not the pharmaceutical companies' vaccines alone. It actually belongs in part to the public, and it belongs to a number of not-for-profit organizations. In some cases in the US, the NIH, the US NIH, the US government are actually co-owners and co-funders of some of the front-runner vaccines. So it's estimated from what we know that at least $10 billion was invested to accelerate vaccine research. So the myth that only pharmaceutical companies basically use their own investment or only exclusively use their own profits to channel back into COVID vaccine research is something that needs to be addressed, because that's not the factual evidence and that's not necessarily correct. So the argument then, as human rights lawyers and activists that we have, is that when you have substantial co-funding and public investment in a number of these technologies, particularly the mRNA technology for some of the vaccines, then governments actually have an obligation to step in and to make sure that the technology can be shared. So I really urge you to look at the slide, because it indicates for the vaccines that are potentially being selected for South Africa, the AstraZeneca vaccine with Oxford University, the Pfizer vaccine with BioNTech, a state company in Germany, and then Johnson & Johnson as well, and potentially even Sputnik, the Gamaleya company that is through Russia. There's been a substantial amount of state investment and public funding. And even in the case of one vaccine, the Dolly Parton vaccine fund was actually a co-funder, and that's the NIH Moderna vaccine. So yeah, there's certainly been substantial co-investment. So the issue is, why were patents granted when there's been substantial public co-investment, and why are governments like the UK, the US, and Germany, who did invest in vaccine research, not stepping in significantly or with a lot of, power and asserting their authority around the sharing of that technology? Next slide. So this links to what Sharifa mentioned earlier around the TRIPS waiver, because one of the things we've learned, quite a hard lesson from the HIV/AIDS crisis, is that if you rely on benevolence and charity of the pharmaceutical industry, you'll never have meaningful access. And I think 1 year later into this pandemic, we've seen sort of the evidence of that. So while the vaccine research was being accelerated through multiple means and measures and through different initiatives and through a lot of co-funding, and really through the pioneering work of a lot of scientists and government scientists and clinicians and researchers and healthcare workers and volunteers around the world, in parallel to that, the South African and Indian government basically brought a proposal to the WTO in October of 2020 to ask for a formal waiver of certain provisions of TRIPS for the duration of the pandemic for all COVID-19 related technologies, not just vaccines, includes treatments or diagnostics, and not just for patents, includes industrial designs, copyrights, etc. So it's quite, it's broader than just the patents, because even if you just lift the patents, it's not going to be sufficient. But prior to the formal submission of the request in July already of last year, the South African government delegation in Geneva basically prepared a submission indicating that given our past and given the crisis with HIV/AIDS in particular, and given how the industry has operated in the last 20 years at least, where medicines are increasingly beginning to be treated as a commodity as opposed to a life-saving intervention, that there's likely to be multiple difficulties with using the flexibilities of TRIPS. The Doha Declaration flexibilities have really been invoked. Compulsory measures, when attempted, basically result in trade pressure or in litigation. And so had already started giving the warning signs around why a waiver would be necessary, and the waiver is permitted in terms of the WTO rules in terms of the Marrakesh Declaration. But as you know, that this waiver, and if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see, if it can be larger, the opponents and the supporters of the TRIPS waiver. And I always like to show these slides sort of on the same page, because it shows you, in respect of the first slide, what the situation is with vaccine access. And the countries in the first slide in relation to vaccine access and immunization shows North America and most parts of South America and Europe in green, right? So that's the first slide around when are we likely to achieve widespread immunity in many parts of the world. And you'll see that Africa is mostly red and parts of Asia are orange. South Africa is a bit of an outlier there because it seems like we have a different access situation, playing out. But if you look at the second slide, you'll see the reverse. The countries that are opposing the TRIPS waiver and the countries that are undecided and the countries that are blocking the TRIPS waiver are the very countries that have already started their vaccination programs and have enough supplies to cover their populations, in some cases 3, 4, 5 times over. And in addition to securing supplies from bilateral agreements, are also securing supplies from what's called the COVAX mechanism, and we can deal with that in the Q&A. So there's a certain irony. It's not just a moral issue. I think it's also shameful that the very countries and governments that are blocking the TRIPS waiver today, in fact, these discussions are ongoing in Geneva yesterday and today, which is why today is sort of marking the Global Day of Action as well. Those countries are blocking access for the Global South, which means that in some parts of the Global South, particularly where you see the red parts of a lack of access in the first map, that you're only likely to get enough supplies for widespread population immunity in those countries by maybe 2023, 2024, which means that you have a few potential problems. So one is the possibility of more variants, and obviously you're dealing with a mutating virus, the possibility of vaccine resistance developing, because some parts of the world would get vaccines, other parts would not, more travel restrictions, and potentially even more waves, and as a result of that, more lockdowns and more repression. So if we look at the next slide, it gives you an indication of the number of doses that have been over-ordered. So already by shortly after the South African and Indian government brought the TRIPS waiver proposal to the WTO in October, by September and October already, Oxfam and Human Rights Watch had been commissioning reports and had indicated that many countries, including Canada, the UK, the European Union, Australia, the US, all those countries who are actually blocking the TRIPS waiver, over-ordered because they were hedging their bets, because they didn't know which vaccines would be considered safe and effective. And as you know, some of the vaccines only started getting emergency use authorization over December 2020 and January 2021. In fact, in South Africa, not a single vaccine has been registered as yet for broad human use or outside of a clinical trial. The Johnson & Johnson Healthcare Workers Sisonke program is actually a study trial because the AstraZeneca healthcare worker batch was actually paused given the data that was shared sort of a few weeks ago in relation to its potential limited efficacy for our variant. So if you look at Canada, for example, I'll just single out Canada and UK. They both have ordered more vaccines than they need through bilateral agreements with the front-runner vaccine companies. And so there's an issue also about what is your obligation in a pandemic as a pharmaceutical company not to basically be allowing a situation of vaccine nationalism and allowing the highest bidder to get first dibs on the limited supplies that you have because you're refusing to scale up manufacturing and you're refusing to let others sort of supply. In addition to that, Canada and UK are drawing stock and supplies from COVAX, which is meant to be one of the mechanisms to address equity in low and middle income countries. So that is a situation around over-ordering, which is what we call hoarding, and also vaccine nationalism. Now, if you look at the EU and the number of doses ordered, it doesn't necessarily mean that those doses have actually arrived. And so a few weeks ago, you saw the supply crisis because of the bottleneck related to the number of supplies that are actually coming into the EU. And so the EU responded by basically taking on one pharmaceutical company, AstraZeneca, which is quite ironic, insisting that their orders should be honored first, and then responding by invoking an export ban, and also now apparently drawing supplies from the Serum Institute, which was meant to be supplying the AstraZeneca vaccine to low and middle income countries. Next slide.
Sorry, Fatima, 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. Ooh, okay, so it's against that context that I think you just see a number of institutions like the African Union supporting the TRIPS waiver. They've now all come out, the International Commission for Jurists, the WHO DG, the Vatican. So there's definitely a momentum building around relaxation of some of the, around some of the demands around dropping the patents and lifting the IP restrictions on scaling up manufacturing so that you can achieve equity in many parts of the global south so that you can achieve widespread immunity faster, which links to my introductory slides about the people's vaccine, about everyone everywhere getting access to it quite soon. So if you just look at the next slide, quickly in the last 2 minutes, we can talk about COVAX in the Q&A session. The important thing to note is that the latest reports are that where there are supplies, and obviously there's a self-created scarcity and there's limited stock around the world, 75% of existing supplies have been administered in 10 countries, while most countries, about 130 in what we call the global south, have had very little shots actually administered, including in our own country, or have actually had zero vaccines. Some supplies have now started coming in from COVAX for Africa, but COVAX is only likely to cover 27% of vulnerable populations by the end of 2021, and maybe only 2 to 3% of vulnerable populations in the first quarter of 2021. And that's why the WHO has called this a moral catastrophe. The next slide. I think I won't go through the details of that, and we can deal with that in the Q&A if you want specific details about the situation in South Africa. Next slide. Similarly, this is the situation around Africa, and I've mentioned COVAX. And again, if you want specific details, we will share the presentation so you'll be able to see which countries are supposed to be getting supplies this week, next week, and what the numbers are looking like. Next slide. So yeah, I just want to, if you just go back to the previous slide, I just want to talk about the different ways that are now being mooted, because yesterday Australia has now just come up with a wave 5 about how you scale up manufacturing and, in their view, not limit intellectual property. And that's why I say we have an existential problem. So what we call wave 1 is the waiver. Wave 2 is compulsory licensing, which resides in the DART declaration. The new DG of the WTO is now talking about wave 3, which is basically relying on the voluntary cooperation of the drug companies, which we don't support because benevolence will never get you sustainable supplies. The WHO is now talking about their own way, which is to try and get meeting with manufacturers this week and governments to address bottlenecks on quite an urgent basis, and talking about diversion of some supplies so that at least healthcare workers all around the world can get vaccinated. And like I said, Australia and a number of countries, to try and stall the waiver negotiations, have now come up with a new document, we really, it doesn't make any sense, and we would call that wave 5. So there's a lot of effort to try and block the waiver. And in a system where you rely on rules and when you rely on rule of law, it just really doesn't make sense that you wouldn't support the waiver and you wouldn't support compulsory measures. The next 2 slides are sort of the last slides, and it's just to indicate to you that all of the drug companies that we are potentially going to be buying vaccines from have said to the US Congress that they oppose the waiver. And what was quite funny or sad or ironic was that Moderna wasn't even familiar about what the TRIPS waiver proposal was all about. And I've argued previously in foreign policy that we're going to be allowing a system where the companies are going to be creating a system of vaccine apartheid. So the last slide is just to mark the 1-year declaration. Today, there is a global day of action. You would have seen some of our comrades protesting outside Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer this morning. In both cases, those companies were so scared to even receive the memorandum that they refused to come out to accept it. So there's a real concern about how pharmaceutical companies, as well as our government, are refusing to be transparent and to engage with civil society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fatima. I think we can all agree that the speakers have done a great job. We've covered an enormous amount of ground globally and in South Africa. I do see that there's been a number of questions which I've taken note of from everyone. And I propose that we'll start with that, but I also think that if you want to ask a question, please do raise your hand or to indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question. But I propose to start with the questions that are in the chat already that we have for our speakers, if that's okay. So the first questions from Dr. Ziegler are for Sharifa. So Sharifa, there were two questions. I don't know if you saw them for you, but let me just repeat for everyone who wants so that they can see. The first question is about the risks of digitalization. And so Dr. Ziegler is asking, how do you overcome risks of the use of digitalization as a way to basically discriminate against undocumented migrants? And his second question for you was about vaccine tourism. And are there any, in your view, any justifications for states prioritizing citizens or long-term residents or conditioning vaccine eligibility on minimum residence requirements or immigration status? So if you could answer those two questions, please.
Yeah. So thanks, Ruby, for your questions. So I think that it's almost inevitable in some ways that digitalization will be used against illegal migrants, against all sorts of groups. And we've written about this when we wrote a paper on public health surveillance and how it has changed in the wake of this current crisis, that it's become so digitized. And I think for me, that's the greatest change, and that's the greatest privatization grab that I have seen, that digitization, even I think over medicines, that has happened within this current crisis. And I think it's really and deeply problematic, because when we looked at it, for instance, it was very clear to us that private companies are manufacturing, storing all this data without any transparency at all from public citizens as to how their data is going to be used, as to how it's going to be stored, and also as to how it will be, that there were no guarantees around privateering kind of at a later date. And so I have like enormous concerns about this. With regards to the second question about whether or not there is ever a case to prioritize citizens, no, because when I think about vaccination, I really kind of think that if vulnerability is at the core of vaccination drives or of any kind of right to health outcome, and vaccination would be one of them, then we need to think about the most vulnerable people. And the most vulnerable people are people who cannot ask anybody for their rights. And I think that, as David said, we need to start thinking of vulnerability in a much broader way from the way in which we've been conceptualizing it. And we try and do this in that paper when we talk about kind of not only kind of the vulnerabilities which public health professionals like, which are comorbidities that we can see and that are easy to identify, but also social vulnerabilities that are so important. Is it possible to do it without digitization? Absolutely. So Ebola was not digitized when they were eradicating it. We see lots of public health surveillance mechanisms that are not largely digitized that happen. There is quite a lot of evidence that actually manual contact tracing is much more reliable than digitized contact tracing. And so there's a lot of non-evidence from the digitization camp. And I'm just really worried that we are taking the fact that there are new shiny tools as evidence, which is really problematic for public health outcomes. Sorry, I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Sharifa. And I think that we are all very worried. I mean, like, this is a question that comes, I think, from concern in the European context from Dr. Ziegler, but it's as much of a concern here in Southern Africa. We are experiencing in South Africa, the government is saying that it will provide for undocumented migrants, but somehow implies that it's going to have to provide them with documents first, which, you know, there's a reason why people are undocumented. And the same problems are happening in other Southern African countries. Botswana and Zimbabwe seem to have suggested that they are only going to provide for citizens, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very topical issue, and that's why I thought it was a good way to start. Now there's questions from two colleagues of mine. So Sam Zarifi, who's the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists, and Carlos Lopez, who is our lead on business and human rights. These others can comment on, but I think, David, they are primarily for you. And so just so that everybody can know the questions, Carlos's question is, there are a number of countries that recognize legal obligations for corporations and juristic persons in respect to fundamental rights, but there's no evidence that this has changed the facts on the ground relating to vaccine nationalism, corruption, et cetera, et cetera. A good example, by the way, would also be the Ecuador resolution that I'm talking about, that is intended to be passed, and there's even a denial of the formal responsibilities in countries that have accepted these obligations. So Carlos's question is, if there's no evidence that this is making any difference, then what do you think the legal obligations will make a different impact in this context? Sam's questions are, first question, how do you suggest imposing the changes in corporate law? So purely on pharmaceutical, I think PMs is pharmaceutical companies across multiple jurisdictions. And then the second one is, arguably existing state obligations demand state-owned pharmaceutical manufacturers to distribute vaccines freely to other states in a way that these obligations don't apply to purely private corporate entities whose legal obligation is maximizing profit. So David, if you could start there, and then if anyone wants to come in on those, I think Fatima, you might also want to come in on this, because maybe, I don't know if you were suggesting that after the first two presentations, but do you think it makes a difference in the long term to vaccine access if we accept that there are actually human rights obligations on corporations? So yes, so first David, and then maybe Sharif or Fatima, if you want to come in on that.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks for the questions to the colleagues from the ICJ. And I would love to engage them more. We won't have a long time to do so now. Firstly, in relation to Carlos's question, I mean, I think what he's saying is that many countries have recognized formally legal obligations, but they haven't really accepted them, right? And I think that's true in South Africa. I think it's true in Latin America, but there hasn't been an internalization of the fact that actually the constitutional frameworks have fundamentally changed matters. And actually, that's coming not only from the private sector, but it's also coming from governments. And so ultimately it requires, I mean, some of what I'm saying does require a shift in the way we think. And I think this is perhaps one of the important issues for thinking about a post-COVID world, of how do we move beyond the current blockages in our way of thinking to actually say, well, it's so evident, this is so unfair. How do we shift to recognize that fundamental rights actually require these things of individuals? Now, I think some of that's going to come from, it's going to come from activism, like Fatima's organization and many other organizations are engaging in globally. It also comes from, I think we need to test these things more, right? I mean, we need to bring litigation. We need to get people to realize that there are actually implications of the rights and the expansion that, as you've said, Tim, that the Constitutional Court of South Africa has now essentially recognized direct obligations of corporations. It has been a little bit, let's just say, on the one hand, it occasionally sort of touches on the notion that there may be positive obligations. It's recognized that, in fact, the majority of the Constitutional Court, but it always gets a little bit hazy, like in the recent Pridwin case, about it doesn't so much like the idea of positive obligations, and sort of stands back from a full recognition that, let's say, a private school, which in my view, clearly by taking on the ability to educate people to realize their right to education has positive obligations, right? And the court, yeah, it gets a little bit fuzzy about that and scared about it. But nevertheless, I think we should empower, and that's part of making these arguments, and more people, I hope, around the world will start doing that, is actually that there's nothing, that in fact, it's an implication and requirement of fundamental rights that individuals and corporations around the world, and specifically strong organizations like corporations, have these obligations. So yes, I think the reason we haven't seen major changes, Carlos, is because there hasn't been an internalization as yet of these understandings. And I think that requires really a multi-pronged approach, which allows me to sort of jump into, I'm just trying to get Sam's questions up. And I think that was also a question of how do we actually bring about those changes internationally? Well, I would support Fatima's call on a practical level for the TRIPS waiver, or the use of some of the exceptions in the WTO agreement, and that those things are practically how one could apply now. But I don't think we should only think now. I think we should actually think about how do we embed this understanding, firstly in international law, right? So unfortunately, as the colleagues know, the treaty is quite unambitious at the moment. The draft treaty, if it gets off the table on business and human rights, doesn't really go this far in looking at obligations. And I think that's a great shame. I don't think that's necessarily going to change, but we do need to encourage committees, for example, like the Human Rights Committee took this fantastic decision to expand the notion of the right to life. And we need to invite them. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has recently addressed the obligations of business entities, and we need to invite them to take stronger views on business obligations in the context of the right to health. And then, as I said, law in specific jurisdictions. The difficulty for specific jurisdictions is, of course, that let's say you have a progressive South African decision which requires waiving of intellectual property rights, that can lead to effectively sanctions against South Africa itself. So the courts may find themselves in a difficult global situation as well. So yes, I mean, I was addressing in a way from the perspective of fundamental rights law, and I think that is the imbalance at the moment, that there's a focus on corporate rights, on protecting intellectual property, without really sort of seeing the weight of the fundamental rights obligations that exist in international law. And I think we should do that. I do also, in my book, also engage with the fact that fundamental rights require fundamental changes to corporate law once we recognize that corporations have fundamental rights obligations. And that's something I can't address now, but I do think it's a really serious and important thing about law reform and law reform initiatives that have to take place across the world. And just a quick answer, because I don't want to take all the time, and I'm sure Fatima has things to add, and Sharifa may also have on these points. Just on state-owned corporations, I think that's in a way an easier case, right? Because I think state-owned corporations, in a sense, try to get the benefits of being private, but they're not really private. They're actually, I would argue, part of the state. In South Africa, we call it an organ of state. And so as such, in a sense, would attract the obligations of states, which are more developed in international law, often more developed even in local laws, than the obligations of corporations. And so I think in the case of state-owned corporations, we could even make stronger cases that existing law is perhaps even more clearly binding in this regard, and that but as I said, in relation to positive obligations, one will always need to consider the other actors that are in that space. So I wouldn't say, because let's say if we, for reasons of thinking, let's imagine AstraZeneca is owned by the UK government, I wouldn't say necessarily the whole burden of provision worldwide would fall on the UK government. It would still need to think about the obligations of other private actors and sharing of the burdens equitably in that sense.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna go to Fatima now to answer two questions. The first one is that, do these things make a difference? Would recognition in the long term for medicine access, including vaccines, not just COVID-19, would the recognition as rights and responsibilities of corporations or obligations of corporations make a difference? But then the second question, because it is, Dr. Ziegler has also asked it, and it is a constant concern that comes up. Assuming that there is a TRIPS waiver, there are concerns about whether or not there should be differential pricing depending on states' contributions to production of vaccines and the costs involved in producing it and the roles of different states. So if, Fatima, you could come in maybe on both of those questions.
Thanks. So I mean, I think David is right, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. We certainly didn't think that companies would respond in this pandemic to the way they responded in the HIV/AIDS pandemic. We thought everybody learned their lesson and everybody was offering solidarity, in January of 2020, but that's not what has happened. And so ultimately, I think there is a profiteering motive that underpins a lot of these, the conduct of a lot of these corporations. So we've got a medicine access crisis in South Africa, and definitely in the region. So I think the obligations on a number of these multinational companies that are operating in South Africa within a constitutional democracy have to be tested. And we really have to push the envelope, because it's not just vaccines. Today it's vaccines, tomorrow it's treatment, the next day it's going to be cancer medications or innovations or HIV. The problem that we have is that multinational companies and their CEOs and their shareholders, and we saw it this morning with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, the way they responded to civil society, sort of, trying to just hand over a letter, is that they don't accept that they are subject to any law, and they don't accept that they are subject to any rules. And we see how these companies sort of operate in the EU, whether it's in the US. There's always a pushback, and there's a lot of vested interest and a lot of funding of opposition political parties and lobbying. And, we saw this in terms of their preferential access to a lot of US senators and people in Congress to try and actually block the TRIPS waiver. So at the moment, I would argue 5 companies have the world to ransom. because they don't want to recognize the different UN declarations, statements after statements, different domestic laws and different types of mechanisms that actually create some kind of obligation on them. In South Africa, when you try and challenge a multinational pharmaceutical company on their pricing, and so this issue about differential pricing, I mean, there's no pricing transparency. When you do, you get an army of lawyers who basically come and argue jurisdiction, and they say that, well, we're not actually, we're not subject to your competition law, we're not subject to your constitution, yet you operate in South Africa. So those issues, I think, have to be tested. And when I say that these companies have held us hostage, at the moment, the reason why I'm saying they don't recognize any of the rules and the norms and the standards is they have non-disclosure agreements. There is no pricing transparency. They have asked countries to give up their sovereign assets, to put that as surety for no-fault compensation schemes. So that's the situation and the climate that we're dealing with. The other problem, I think, David, is, and we've spoken about this before, is our courts. In 100 years in South Africa, we've never issued one compulsory license on a pharmaceutical product. And we have one of the world's, greatest HIV, TB, and malaria, or in some other parts of Africa, we have a malaria crisis. So there is a difference. Yusuf Wouda and them have written this brilliant paper on how the courts have treated pharmaceutical patents and their protections. There is an over deference, and we saw that in the Competition Appeal Court when we tried to argue, the obligations of companies like Dis-Chem or Babalegi in terms of not pricing excessively on face masks. So there is a reluctance, I think, by our judiciary to actually say, yes, in this particular circumstance, in a pandemic, in an epidemic, we are going to suspend your intellectual property rights. We are going to suspend the ability of a corporate to make as much money as it can. And until we shift the judiciary and actually get Parliament to do its job, and the Minister of Health and the President, you're arguing one thing in Geneva, but domestically, your hands are tied with these pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's what makes us angry, and that's what enrages us, because there's a lot of double speak. And so these embassies and these companies will tell us and lecture us about transparency and accountability and rule of law, but won't subject themselves to the same standards. So yeah, I mean, that's my answer.
And let me just add, I think, Tim, if I just may add to, I think it's lamentable that the Competition Appeal Court in the Health Justice Initiative actually launched this claim against excessive pricing, and they focused just on the Competition Act and in the judgment without saying anything about they had argument before them about the obligations of corporations, and they just for whatever reason ignored it. And actually some of the judges are progressive judges, and so it's just hard to understand, and we really need to try and enable our courts to take that on and to actually recognize what fundamental rights require of these private actors.
Yeah, I mean, just if I can quickly add on that, we've argued that Section 27 of the Constitution in a pandemic has to be interpreted in a very different way, which gives effect to the right to substantive equality, dignity. You've got to recognize the issue of a public health crisis. We couldn't make that argument because AfriForum and Solidarity withdrew their case before we could make those arguments without them answering those particular claims. So, the private sector is scared, I think, of us and our ability to assert these arguments. And I think David is right. We need many more legal cases, and we need judges who are actually willing to say that you can take away intellectual property rights without necessarily killing off innovation or without necessarily closing a multinational company. That's not going to be the result of suspending intellectual property protections.
Okay, so now at this point, I think we have just about 3 minutes left. Sharifa, I'm going to ask you, because we have that limited time, to come in on this question, but in a closing remark of about a minute. I know it's a really, really hard thing to do. And then I'm going to ask in the reverse order that we've heard people speaking, David and Fatima to come in, and then we'll close. Or maybe actually, Fatima, you come in next, and then David, because David can close for us as a co-host. If that's fine with everyone, then from my side, my job is done. And thank you for a very stimulating conversation, which I'm sure everyone's going to benefit from. And we'll send around a link to the recording once we're done. So Sharifa first, and then Fatima, and then David.
Yeah, so final thoughts. I always think about myself as a very kind of normative person, as opposed to a very legal person. So I struggle. But I think that in some ways being in South Africa should make us optimistic. Things change. They sometimes take a very long time, but we get rid of inequality by always struggling against it, by calling it out, by telling people about it in different ways. And in some ways, we have all done that. We have all told a story about inequality in our different ways and about the power of corporations in these different ways. And I think we need to reach more people. And I think people would be outraged with these stories, and we just need to keep going at it.
Thanks, Fatima.
Yeah, I mean, my plea to everybody is that we've got to create a movement where we recognize that life-saving interventions are actually public goods, because we've been through this before, and we've went through a lot of premature suffering and death at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And already 17,000 healthcare workers around the world have died of COVID unnecessarily, needlessly. There is a fundamental problem when a young, fit, healthy person in America is being vaccinated, while all our healthcare workers in Africa have not even been vaccinated. And so that tells you that we have a crisis of capitalism, and we also have a crisis of the way in which multinationals exert their power. And so that needs to be addressed. There is a pernicious power that exists within these companies. They are refusing to answer questions even of journalists. So the whole way in which our democratic institutions work in South Africa at every single level, from parliament to the media to the executive to opposition parties who have been complaining about every single aspect of this pandemic and every single regulation, but are totally silent on the role of pharmaceutical companies. That tells you then we have a real problem in the way in which their power is actually able to shape public policy and prevent meaningful access to vaccines and other interventions in this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for your insights and for all of the hard work on these issues. Now, last to David to give his final comments and to close.
Thanks, Tim, for chairing. And yes, in conclusion, I think we have to just boil it down to something quite simple. There's a vaccine that can help prevent the loss of life, that can help people avoid suffering from terrible harms. It is not necessarily that expensive to produce. It is possible to do so. And we're now thinking still of 2 years in which many people will not have access to that, and many, many people will suffer and die. This is an unfairness. This cannot be allowed to exist. It relates to our most fundamental interests. And we don't also have to destroy companies to do so. That's what I've tried to say that. So, I mean, I agree with Fatima. I think that our healthcare should not be seen as an ordinary market. It should be seen differently. And similarly, goods like education, it also should be seen differently. But at the same time, it is possible to work to an extent within the current system while still ensuring greater, fairer access across the world. And I think that is a pressing, urgent fundamental rights claim that we should all unite behind and actually need to push this demand, because I think, as Fatima said, the reason the companies are afraid is they can't defend restricted access. They can't defend the naked profiteering at the expense of people's lives. So I hope the seminar has helped unpack some of those questions, to engage with them. Thank you to the other speakers. Thank you to Tim for chairing. Thanks for all those involved in organizing and the organizations that have been co-sponsored this. And I do hope that we can actually try and find our way out of a post-COVID world, out of COVID into a post-COVID world, which is fairer and which kind of establishes a different set of principles where ultimately individuals, their health, their life, their well-being comes first. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye. And please share the recording. Those of you who attended, share it with others, and feel free to make it accessible, because hopefully we'll engage other ideas.
Yeah, David, I suggest, because they've been requested, if it's possible, if we can send the recording with all 3 PowerPoint presentations around onto the list of people who attended. I think that a lot of people would appreciate that from what people have been saying to me.
Great. We will definitely do that. And also